Have you ever heard the story of a young orphan girl who became queen in a foreign empire, and with one brave decision saved an entire nation? This is the story of Esther. You might not be familiar with it, but it's a must-heard story for you today. Courage, danger, and destiny collide, and everything hangs on a single decision. Will she act, or will silence cost a nation? Stay with us, because what happens next could change everything. The night the decree was written, no one heard Esther cry. The city slept beneath torchlight and stone, unaware that its fate had already been sealed in wax and law. Somewhere within the walls of the Persian palace, a ring had pressed into warm clay, and with that simple motion, thousands of lives were quietly sentenced. Men, women, children, names that would never be read aloud, all reduced to a single decision made in comfort. Esther did not know this yet. At this moment, she was still just a young woman standing at the edge of power, carrying a name she rarely spoke, and a past she had learned to keep hidden. The crown on her head would come later. The fear would come later. The choice, the one history would remember, had not yet demanded her answer. But everything that would follow was already moving toward her. Long before palaces and silken curtains, before oil lamps and guarded doors, Esther's story began quietly, in displacement. She was born into exile, Esther 2:7. Her people were not where they belonged. They lived under a foreign sky, obeyed foreign laws, and spoke their prayers in whispers learned from memory. Generations earlier, they had been taken from their land, scattered across an empire that did not know their songs or their God. By the time Esther was born, exile no longer shocked anyone. It was simply life. Her parents did not survive long enough to explain this world to her. Scripture records it briefly, almost coldly, that Esther was an orphan. Esther 2:7. It does not linger on the nights she may have cried for voices she could barely remember, or the way loss teaches a child to grow up quietly. But absence shapes a person. It teaches restraint. It teaches observation. It teaches silence. She was taken in by her cousin Mordecai, a man older, cautious, and deeply aware of the danger of being visible in a land where power belonged to others. Esther 2:7. He raised her not with ambition, but with caution. He taught her when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. Esther learned early that survival often depends not on strength, but on timing. She was known then as Hadassah, her Hebrew name, a name rooted in her people's history, Esther 2:7. But names carry risk, and in Persia, where identity could invite suspicion, another name would serve her better. Esther. It sounded softer, it blended in, it hid what needed to stay hidden. The empire she lived under was vast, stretching farther than most people could imagine. Its king ruled from a throne, built on fear and splendor in equal measure. King Ahasuerus, known elsewhere as Xerxes, governed not merely through law, but through spectacle. His power was not subtle. It was announced in banquets that lasted for days, in wealth displayed without apology, in commands that traveled faster than resistance could form. Esther 1:3-4. To be noticed by such a king was not a blessing. It was a risk. The palace itself was a world apart, sealed off from ordinary life by walls, guards, and protocol. Decisions made inside its chambers rippled outward, touching lives that would never cross its gates. Most people would live and die without ever seeing its inner courts. Esther never planned to be among those chosen to enter. But power has a way of reaching into lives without asking permission. The moment that changed everything did not begin with Esther at all. It began with another woman, Queen Vashti. Let's pause for a second. If you're new to this channel, you're welcomed. Do well to hit the subscribe button. Every new subscriber helps us craft stories that bring the Bible to life, teaching lessons of faith, bravery, and heart. Join the family and walk with us as we explore stories that change lives. One hero, one moment, one story at a time. God bless you. Now let's continue. During one of the king's extravagant banquets, a command was sent for Vashti to appear before the gathered officials and nobles, summoned not for council or ceremony, but to be displayed. The request, wrapped in royal authority, stripped dignity into spectacle. Esther 1:12-13. Vashti refused. In a court built on obedience, refusal was more dangerous than rebellion. Her decision unsettled the men who advised the king, not because of its moral weight, but because of its implications. If a queen could say no, what would that teach other women? What precedent would it set? The concern was not justice, it was control. And so Vashti was removed, erased from position and memory with the stroke of policy. Her crown was taken. Her name faded from the court's conversation. What remained was an empty space beside the throne. That space would not remain empty for long. A search was ordered, not for wisdom, not for leadership, but for beauty. Young women were gathered from across the provinces, taken into the king's harem under the pretense of selection, though few would ever be chosen. The rest would disappear quietly into the background of palace life, remembered by no one outside its walls. Esther 2:2-3. This was not an opportunity. It was a summons. Esther did not volunteer, she was taken. The text is careful here, and the detail matters. She was brought, not invited. Choice was not part of the process. This was empire logic. When power calls, consent is assumed. Mordecai said little when it happened. He knew better than to resist openly. Resistance draws attention. Attention draws danger. Instead, he gave Esther one instruction, spoken with the weight of experience. Do not reveal who you are. Not your people, not your past, not your God. Esther 2:10. Survival, once again, would depend on silence. Inside the palace, time moved differently. Days were measured not by sunrise and sunset, but by schedules, rituals, and preparations designed to strip individuality and replace it with polish. Esther was given oils, garments, and instruction, how to walk, how to speak, how to wait. Everything was curated to make her pleasing, but nothing was designed to make her powerful. Esther 2:12-13. And yet, something quiet was happening beneath the surface. Esther listened. She watched how servants spoke to officials, how fear shifted rooms before commands were spoken. She learned which voices mattered and which were ignored. She did not force herself forward. She did not draw attention. She found favor not through display, but through presence, calm, observant, unthreatening. Esther 2:15. When the night came for her to be presented before the king, Esther did not demand excess. She asked for nothing beyond what was given. In a court obsessed with display, restraint stood out. And the king noticed. Of all the women brought before him, Esther lingered in his mind. Whether it was her beauty, her composure, or simply the way she did not reach for power, we are not told. Scripture often leaves space where certainty would distract from meaning. What matters is the result. The crown was placed on her head. Esther 2:17. From orphan to royalty, her rise looked sudden, almost effortless. But crowns do not erase vulnerability. They only hide it beneath gold. Esther's position came with visibility, but not security. She had influence, but only within boundaries she did not control, and she remained silent about who she was. Outside the palace, Mordecai continued his quiet routine, often sitting near the gate where information flowed more freely than inside royal chambers. It was there that he uncovered a plot. 2 officials planning the king's assassination. He reported it, not for reward, but for preservation. Esther 2:21-22. The plot was stopped, the conspirators were executed. The event was recorded in the royal chronicles. And then, like many acts of quiet integrity, it was forgotten. Time passed. Power shifted again. A man named Haman rose through the ranks, elevated by the king to a position above all other officials. With authority came expectation that others would bow, would acknowledge his status with visible submission. Most complied. Most found it easier to bend than to risk offense. Mordecai did not. His refusal was not loud. It was not violent, it was simply absence. The absence of submission where it was expected. But absence can be louder than protest. Esther 3:2. Haman noticed, and unlike many men in power, Haman did not limit his anger to the one who offended him. He widened it. Learning that Mordecai belonged to a people with a shared identity, Haman chose not merely revenge, but eradication. This is where personal pride turned into collective threat. A single man's wounded ego became the justification for genocide. Esther 3:6. Haman did not present his plan as hatred. He framed it as efficiency. A group of people, scattered, different, following their own laws, inconvenient, disloyal, expendable. The language was careful. It always is. The king agreed without investigation. Esther 3:12. The ring pressed into wax. The decree went out. On a single appointed day, throughout the empire, an entire people would be destroyed, their property taken, their lives ended, legally. The city of Susa reacted with confusion and grief. Mourning filled the streets. Mordecai tore his garments and sat in ashes, a visible symbol of despair that could not be ignored. Esther 4:13. Inside the palace, Esther remained unaware. Royal isolation is its own kind of blindness. Comfort dulls urgency. Walls keep out more than noise. They keep out truth until someone risks breaking protocol. Mordecai sent word to Esther, not softly, not vaguely, clearly. Everything is at stake. Esther's response was not immediate courage. It was fear, real, rational fear. No one approached the king without being summoned. To do so was death, unless he extended his scepter. And Esther had not been called in 30 days. Esther 4:11. Silence, once a shield, now felt like a trap. Mordecai's reply cut through hesitation with clarity that did not flatter or comfort. Relief would come from somewhere else, he said. But she and her household would not escape if she remained silent. And then he spoke words that would echo far beyond that moment. Words later preserved in Scripture, recorded not as command, but as possibility. Esther 4:14. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The question did not demand belief, it demanded decision. Esther stood at the edge of a choice no crown could protect her from. To remain silent was safer, for now. To speak was to step into uncertainty with no guarantee of survival. This was the moment the story had been moving toward all along. Not the crown, not the palace, but the decision. She asked for time, for fasting, for preparation that went deeper than garments or strategy. What she sought was alignment, courage anchored in purpose, not impulse. Esther 4:16. Then she spoke the words that would define her legacy, words Scripture preserves without embellishment, as recorded in the book of Esther, chapter 4. If I perish, I perish. Esther 4:16. It was not resignation. It was resolve. Esther prepared to step toward the throne, not knowing whether the next moment would bring favor or death. And this is where we pause. Because the door has not yet opened. Esther's heart pounded in the quiet of her chamber. Every breath seemed amplified, every shadow a silent observer. The silence was thick, almost tactile, yet it carried a strange weight, the knowledge that the smallest movement could mean life or death. Her servants had gone. The palace corridors stretched beyond sight, corridors that had been walked by kings, conquerors and courtiers alike, each step echoing authority. She alone now carried the power of choice. The words of Mordecai reverberated in her mind. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther 4:14. It was a question that demanded courage. Not the bravery of swords or armies, but the quiet, unyielding resolve to do what was right, even when the outcome was uncertain. She gathered herself. Every layer of preparation, fasting, prayer, reflection, had led to this moment. She could feel the weight of her people pressing gently upon her shoulders, a responsibility far greater than her own survival. The door loomed ahead, gilded and massive, adorned with symbols of empire, polished to a shine that caught the flickering torchlight. Beyond it, the king rested, unaware that a single woman could alter the course of history. Esther's steps were measured, her mind focused, yet even in that focus she acknowledged fear. The king had not summoned her in 30 days. Esther 4:11. Protocol was law. Crossing the threshold without permission could end her life in an instant, and yet her resolve held. She moved. The chambers were warmer than she expected, scented with incense and the faint aroma of polished floors and rich fabrics. The guards paused, noticing her approach, but their eyes reflected protocol, not intent to harm. She walked as one who belonged, though she knew every moment of hesitation could betray her. When she entered the throne room, the king sat upon his golden chair, an imposing figure of command. His gaze, once focused elsewhere, fell upon her. Time seemed to slow. The weight of centuries of kings and queens, of lore and tradition, pressed into the room like a living force. The king extended the golden scepter, a simple gesture, yet one that separated death from life. Esther approached, her heart steadying against the drumbeat of fear. She touched the tip of the scepter lightly. Relief flooded her briefly. The king's favor had not deserted her. Her voice was calm but firm. She invited the king to a banquet, a private feast for him and Haman. The invitation was unusual, subtly audacious, yet it carried no hint of aggression. Esther knew the power of strategy. She was no longer merely a pawn, she was a player with understanding. Haman arrived, proud and confident. He assumed the banquet would celebrate his own triumph, his dominance recognized by the queen herself. Yet Esther's plan was careful, measured. Words would become instruments, revelation would serve justice. She invited Haman first, with courtesy, masking the tension that simmered beneath her poise. At the banquet, wine was poured. Conversation flowed, yet every sentence was a thread in a tapestry, weaving awareness, influence, and suspense. Esther observed Haman, noting the arrogance in his posture, the imperceptible shifts in his expression when he assumed superiority. It was the second banquet that changed everything. Here, Esther spoke, revealing not only her identity, but the gravity of the decree against her people. She did so with measured words, each one chosen to convey truth without accusation, relying on the king's judgment and sense of justice. Haman, realizing the depth of his miscalculation, felt panic ripple through him. The king's wrath turned swiftly, a storm no human hand could halt. Power shifted in an instant. Where once Haman stood as the architect of genocide, he now faced the instruments of his own undoing. Esther 7:9-10. The king commanded his execution. Haman was hanged upon the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Justice, delayed by arrogance and pride, arrived with absolute finality. Mordecai was elevated, granted authority previously unimaginable, his name inscribed in chronicles, remembered for integrity and courage. Esther 8:2-5. Yet the story did not end with the fall of one man. The threat remained. The decree against the Jews had been sealed by law, and empire law was unyielding. Esther's courage now extended beyond revelation. It required intervention. She drafted letters, formalizing protection for her people, using the king's authority to overturn the mandate of destruction. Esther 8:8. Every province received the message. Every Jew was given the means to defend themselves. Esther's foresight and strategy transformed fear into empowerment. She had acted, but with precision and wisdom, ensuring survival was not only possible, but achievable. The day of confrontation arrived. The Jews defended themselves, and those who sought their destruction were confounded. The reversal was complete. What had been designed as annihilation became triumph. Esther 9:1-5. The empire, once a stage for unchecked ambition, had witnessed the subtle power of courage, preparation, and divine timing. Esther's identity, once hidden, had become the key to life for her people. She had fulfilled the possibility that Mordecai had suggested. She had come to the kingdom for such a time as this, Esther 4:14. Esther's legacy endured. Mordecai instituted the festival of Purim, a lasting celebration of survival, courage, and divine providence. Esther 9:20-22. Each year, Jews remember the events not only for the outcome, but for the deliberate actions that made triumph possible. The throne, once a place of isolation and danger, had become a vantage point for justice and protection. The queen's courage had not only saved a people, but had reshaped the narrative of an empire. And in the quiet moments that followed, Esther reflected on the journey, from orphan to queen, from silence to decisive action, from vulnerability to influence. Every step had been fraught with risk, yet guided by wisdom, restraint, and faith. The story of Esther is a reminder that timing, courage, and strategy often meet in ways that shape history. Scripture tells us this, and its lessons last forever. Those who act with wisdom can turn despair into triumph. The empire continued, but the memory of that decisive moment echoed far beyond the walls of Susa. Power was tempered, pride humbled, and life preserved. It was a true testament to courage aligned with purpose. Haman's fall shook the palace and the empire alike. What began as fear, uncertainty, and a looming decree of destruction became relief. Celebration and careful restoration. Esther and Mordecai moved quickly. Survival was not enough. People needed protection. Laws needed correction. Justice needed permanence. Letters were drafted, sealed with the king's authority, and sent to every province from India to Ethiopia. They gave the Jews the right to defend themselves against those who sought to destroy them. The tension of the past shifted to action. Communities across the empire braced, prayed, and prepared. It was not chaos that followed, but quiet, disciplined strength. People rose to protect their lives, guided by the courage of a queen who risked everything. When the day came, the result stunned the kingdom. Those who planned evil were defeated. Where fear once ruled, victory prevailed. The reversal was thorough, public, and undeniable. The story of survival spread through whispers and proclamations. No one was left unaware of what had happened. Mordecai's rise matched Haman's fall. Elevated to second in command, he now held influence for protection and guidance. He ensured the decree was enforced fairly and gave strength to the vulnerable. Even with authority, he acted with care, mindful of the power he held and the balance of empire and people. Then came the festival, Purim. It celebrated deliverance, not conquest. Esther and Mordecai made this day a permanent reminder of courage, faith, and providence. Every year the story would be retold. Gifts would be given, feasts would be shared. Joy would spread among the people. But the story was more than ritual. It showed what courage, timing, and wisdom can accomplish. Esther, once hidden in the shadows of a palace, became the instrument of life for her people. Her choices, deliberate and brave, changed an entire empire's story. The king, unaware of the divine threads in his court, carried out justice. Yet it was Esther who dared, who approached, who risked everything. Her legacy was not the crown she wore, but the lives she preserved and the justice she achieved. In quiet reflection, one can trace the steps that led to this moment. From orphanhood to queenhood, from fear to decisive action, every detail mattered. Every preparation, every act of restraint, every carefully chosen word, and every fasted day shaped the outcome. Esther 4:16. And the people remembered, not merely the danger they faced, but the courage that saved them. Not the threat, but the triumph. Not the shadow, but the light Esther had brought into the empire. Purim became more than a day of celebration. It became a symbol of divine providence, of courage meeting opportunity, of wisdom guiding decisive action. Esther 9:20-22. Even centuries later, the story resonates. Leaders, ordinary people, those who feel powerless, all can learn from Esther that timing, courage, and faith intersect to create extraordinary outcomes. When one acts with clarity, integrity, and resolve, the impact echoes far beyond immediate perception. The halls of the palace returned to routine, but the echo of that critical moment, the courage of a queen standing before a king, risking all for her people, remained. It reminded all who heard it. Influence is not about position alone, but about action aligned with purpose. Mordecai continued to serve, ensuring that justice, protection, and guidance endured. Esther, the queen who had once hidden her identity, now became a symbol of wisdom and bravery. Together, they had not only changed their people's fate, but had shaped the memory of an empire. And so the story closes, not in the noise of conquest or the spectacle of kings, but in the quiet endurance of courage, the careful exercise of influence, and the lasting triumph of those who act for righteousness. Esther 9:30-32. The legacy of Esther, Mordecai, and Purim lives on, a reminder that courage, faith, and careful action can alter the course of history, that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable threats, the right choices, made at the right time, can save a people. And that providence often works through those willing to act with resolve. If this story has moved you, if Esther's courage, wisdom, and faith have stirred something deep within you, if you feel inspired, encouraged, or even challenged to stand firm in your own life, then don't keep it to yourself. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more powerful Bible stories brought to life, stories that reveal courage, prophecy, and divine purpose in ways you'll never forget, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We also want to hear from you. Comment below and tell us which part of Esther's story touched you the most, and how will you apply her courage in your own life. Your voice matters, and your story could inspire someone else too. Remember, the scriptures are alive and every story carries a lesson.